Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be here with a couple of colleagues that I've known for a long time. Larry and Jan, I've worked with both of them over many years, too many years to really talk about, and very highly qualified and experienced people. So since 1982, I have practiced full-time in the area of forensic and investigative accounting following my brief career as an auditor until I got my CA basically, and then went directly into the forensic side of the business up until a couple years ago when I mostly retired. As I said, I haven't been an auditor since 1981, and so I realized that there's huge changes that have occurred in the profession over the past 35 years, and we certainly just heard from the past speaker about some of the issues that are facing auditors, which I think will actually come into play with probably some of the dialogue that we're going to have this afternoon about how to develop more professional skepticism. Because one thing that really hasn't changed is the need for auditors, finance and accounting executives, and other accountants to develop an appropriate level of professional skepticism. Or in other words, how do you critically assess the information that's being provided to you with the necessary skepticism? So during the course of my career as a forensic accountant, working on hundreds of cases of fraud, bribes and kickbacks, Larry and I even worked on a murder case several years ago, and other types of financial impropriety, I've learned to be highly skeptical about the information that I have been given and told, and so I plan on sharing with you how I developed this heightened degree of skepticism in going about my work. So for me, I try to boil it down into try to boil it down into three elements that work for me. These are three elements that I consider every time I undertake an investigation, a forensic investigation. And they are understanding the motivations of who you are interviewing or investigating. You could substitute the word auditing if you wanted to, or assessing. Deploy effective listening and observation skills. And thirdly, be able to identify barriers to a successful investigation or a successful audit or whatever, and reduce and remove those barriers to the extent that you can. And I remind myself of these elements every time I go about conducting an investigation and interviewing people. So the first critical element is understanding the situation from the other person's point of view. And what might motivate him or her to lie to you or to not provide complete information that you are seeking. The person you are dealing with may be a suspected perpetrator of a fraud, or it may be a person that has information that might be relevant to your investigation or to your audit or whatever type of inquiry that you are making. From my experience, it's rare that the person you are talking to really wants to be there. And many people will tell you what you want to hear or what you think you want to hear so they can get out of there as fast as possible. So one of the first cases I worked on as a forensic accountant taught me a valuable lesson in understanding why someone would have a motive to lie, even after they have been caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. I was retained by the fraud squad of a local police agency here in the Toronto area to investigate an allegation of fraud perpetrated on a municipality here in the Toronto area by two employees of that municipality. The two employees had created a vendor which supposedly sold office supplies to the municipality. Both of the employees were fired by the municipality because they felt that was a conflict of interest, and they were also charged with criminal fraud by the police, so that's why I was brought in. I learned that the municipality was going to file a claim with their insurer, an insurance claim, to try to recover the losses that they thought they had suffered under this arrangement that had been created by these two employees. And they had retained another accounting firm to assist them with the insurance claim. So one of the two employees involved basically agreed to cooperate with the municipality and the police and provide information and testify against the other employee. And his story that he told the accounting firm that was working on the insurance claim was that the scheme involved the two of them purchasing office supplies, pens, papers, paper clips, whatever, from the local Staples store, and then reselling them to the municipality at a markup of 50%, which of course is what they pocketed out of the arrangement. So the accounting firm duly prepared a schedule and a report calculating the true cost of the supplies that have been purchased, quantifying the markup, and the employee then very helpfully offered to pay back his share of the markup that he had pocketed. So it sounds very good, sounds very plausible. The only thing wrong with that scenario was that it was completely wrong. No supplies had ever been purchased by these two employees and resold to the town. The vendor was a complete fake, and every dollar paid by the municipality went straight into the pocket of the two employees. So what did this teach me? I learned that even when caught, the fraudster will continue to lie to minimize the damage to themselves. So this taught me to be skeptical even when presented with an explanation for something that on the surface may sound plausible, and to always consider the true motivations of the fraudster. And always remember that people will say anything to get you off the trail and basically get you to go away with what sounds like a plausible explanation. The second element that I used in developing skepticism is to really learn and then deploy well-honed listening and observation skills. And I know that sounds kind of simplistic, but it's not. Whenever you're interviewing somebody or looking at a process, evaluating a process, internal controls or whatever, there's often clues that are left behind by the person you're speaking with or by the information that you're looking at, which may indicate that the person is lying or the information is wrong or has been manipulated in some fashion. Sometimes it's in the words that people use when they answer your question. Other times there may be body language clues which indicate that they're being deceptive. So it's very important to learn what these clues of deceptive behavior are. So for example, if you're asking a person to describe the process of awarding a tender on a significant construction project, and their answer is usually we do the following, or normally we would ask for 3 bids. That's not an answer to your question. And you'd be amazed at the number of times that people just basically, move on to the next question without drilling down into the specifics of what happened in whatever particular process or contract or transaction or whatever that you're looking at. You need to be skeptical of answers like that and be persistent in answering or asking the question again until you get a proper, complete answer. And many times we don't do that. Many times we just basically move on to the next area of inquiry. Another example would be to challenge explanations that just don't make sense. Once again, that sounds very simple, but in real life it happens all the time. I once investigated a bid rigging allegation where it was alleged that a company executive had steered a contract to his favorite vendor, probably because he was getting some kind of a kickback or benefit from that vendor. But he had created a trail to make it look like a proper process was being followed. So his position was that he had followed policy by asking for and receiving 3 bids from qualified suppliers, which would have been in accordance with the company's policy. So on the surface, it looks okay because 3 bids were indeed asked for and received for the contract, so it looks like everything is okay. But when we look more skeptically at the process, we found the evaluation of those bids that had been received didn't make sense. And that's because the bids were all received when they're supposed to be received, which is at 3 p.m. On the particular day that they were due, and the winner was announced at 3:30 p.m. And we said, how can that be? Because each of the bids was well in excess of 100 pages long, a lot of information to digest. So we concluded it would be virtually impossible to do a proper evaluation of those bids in the short time that it supposedly was done. And that's because they weren't properly evaluated, because the person that had asked for the bids already knew which direction that he wanted the contract to go. And so that process was being manipulated. So that's why it's important to develop your observation skills to heighten your skepticism of the information you're receiving, even if on the surface it looks plausible. So the third element that I always tell myself I need to bear in mind whenever I'm conducting an investigation, and especially when I'm interviewing people, is to be able to identify barriers to a successful investigation and reduce and remove them to the extent that you can. Now, barriers can take on many forms, ranging from not allowing yourself enough time to conduct an appropriately skeptical investigation to mental barriers. These are barriers that are in your head, like having an unconscious or subconscious bias, either against or for the person that you're interviewing, so you're not keeping an open mind when you're going about talking to that person. Sometimes budgets or scope limitation concerns can lead to a rushed investigation or perhaps a rushed audit. And that will not allow enough time for you to develop skepticism to probably the level that you need to if you're always in a rush or you're constrained by an over onerous budget concern. You also have to be aware of the level of the person that you're interviewing. Senior executives are very good at spinning their stories to show them in the best light, so not being intimidated is necessary to remain appropriately skeptical. So you can't be intimidated by these people. During the course of my career, I've interviewed a number of politicians, which are the worst people for answering your question because they don't like to answer the question. They like to tell you what their opinion is, or they're basically, I think the term is pivoting to what message they want to give you. It's not necessarily the answer to your question. So I identified these elements through my involvement in many investigations over many years. So obviously I was not interviewing senior people or senior level politicians or former politicians when I first started out, but I learned by observing from my mentors and more senior practitioners that I was working with. There's also various education and training courses that are available to improve professionals' ability to develop their skepticism and abilities to identify deceptive behavior. Those courses are also very good at helping us get rid of the bad habits that we may have that will inhibit our ability to be a good investigator and to display an appropriate level of skepticism. For example, it's very important that an investigator be a good listener because if you're constantly talking over people or interrupting them, you're not going to get enough information to be able to be skeptical about the information that they are giving you. So what and how should we be teaching students and new professionals? Well, it's basically the skills that I've been talking about. Now, obviously, at least to the best of my knowledge, these are not skills that are being taught in regular accounting courses, at least at the undergraduate level, or to professionals early in their professional career, although these are the types of skills that are taught at, for example, the Master of Forensic Accounting program here at University of Toronto and other education and training that's designed specifically for forensic accountants. So maybe some element of those that education could be or should be incorporated into training of students and younger professionals. But when it comes to areas that require further research, and I'm thinking back to Dr. Jamel's address a few moments ago where we've seen, even in the light of Enron and what happened in the U.S. 15 or 20 years ago with corporate scandals and Sarbanes-Oxley, that audit fees are going down. So that probably means that there may be even less skepticism that's being employed because of severe budget concerns. So the practicalities of using forensic techniques for auditors and other professional accountants has to be examined from that perspective and many others. Because you have to bear in mind that when Jennifer or Larry or myself are asked to undertake a forensic assignment, it's different from a regular audit. When we start our work, there's almost always a suspicion rumor or specific allegation of financial wrongdoing, and that's obviously not usually the case in an audit. So therefore, getting the right balance of forensic techniques in a regular audit needs to be studied. We also must understand that forensic investigations are usually done by people with more experience. As Professor Brooks pointed out, the CPAD study or finding was that 80% of the audit work is being done by very junior people. That does not lend itself well to people that have enough experience to truly be skeptical, because they're probably auditing and interviewing people that are much more senior to them, have been around a lot longer, and as we heard from the previous speaker, may not even be from an accounting background. They may be from an MBA background or another background that may be a little more creative in doing things than a CPA might be. Data analytics, we've heard a lot about this in our world today in business, politics, and in forensic investigations and auditing, including this concept of being able to audit entire populations of transactions rather than relying on sampling. This area, I think, needs to be further studied as well. My own view is that data analytics can be a great tool, but there's always going to be a need to talk to people to find out why they did certain transactions and how they did them. So the skills to develop skepticism that I've talked about today are still going to be required, even in the light of more advanced data analytics techniques. Lastly, further research can and should be conducted to enable us to better understand human behavior, because that's really what we're talking about here, in order to uncover deception more often. So it really goes back to what I talked about earlier about understanding, why someone might not want to be completely truthful with you. If you have a better understanding of that, you might have a better opportunity to be skeptical about their story. So there's always a need for that. So thank you.